We're shifting gears from trans topics to politics. Everywhere you go, his hell is inescapable. Yeah! Hi, and welcome back to the CritFacts show. You know, the show? The one with the fox that talks about horrible people? I think we're allowed to call ourselves a show, right? Or maybe even just a reality fanfiction? If we're lucky, maybe Netflix will sign us on to counterbalance all the transphobic shit they've been platforming. Fingers crossed! Anyway, today's episode is going to be a little different. Not that our other episodes aren't a little different, mind you, but it's just that this episode in particular is going to focus on transphobia outside of right-wing circles. Yes, that includes typical gender-critical circles. We're going to take a look at leftism, and why it is that, generally speaking, trans-positive people seem to naturally gravitate towards leftism. And also, whether or not leftism is good to trans people overall. But wait, I can already hear the voices of our audience from beyond the boundaries of my internet space. I can hear them say, "But CritFacts, you silly sausage! Of course we know why trans people and their allies gravitate towards leftism. It's because leftism promotes progressive values and non-judgmental attitudes towards other people." But what even is leftism? Why is leftism? Can I eat leftism? Whence cometh leftism, and for whom doth leftism toll? If leftism is the way forward, how come they can't see it coming? Is a left by any other net... In case any aliens stumble across this video in a billion years, left and right are political terms that serve as a sort of summary of one's political loyalties. The origin of the term was... there was some Congress or other, and people of one opinion on a big policy vote sat on the right side, and everyone with the other opinion... Look, humans turned the weirdest shit into linguistic tradition. There's disagreement about what counts as biological leftism and an adult human chicken with one right wing, but the general vibe I think we can all agree on is left, take from the rich and give to the poor, diversity good, actually, bigotry bad, actually, the collective should support the individuals, we should improve society somewhat. Socialism is when the government does things. Right is when the rich and the poor both got where they were because they deserved it, so keep it that way. Bigotry is no big deal. Diversity is cringe. Woke bad. I'm just asking questions. Personal responsibility. And the real bigotry is that anti-bigotry goes too far. At least, I think most people, both on the left and the right, would find both of these descriptions reasonable and accurate, even if the outcomes of these philosophies and their connective tissue deserves an entire essay series, at least. If you can understand why people feel strongly about what Hogwarts house they'd get sorted into, you can understand why people feel strongly about which of these two they are seen as. In fact, many will decorate themselves and their devices just to signal to others to what virtues they hold. They will virtue signal, you might even say, to help keep their social circles to people they share the same values with, and to organize into political parties for the purpose of consolidating legal representation into common goals. If you really are an alien finding this, it takes a long time to explain, but basically, at time of recording, we live in a society, tish, and we hope Earth left behind a pretty corpse. Also, please don't study my browser history. And also, if you're looking at my bones to try and sex me, I do not give a damn, despite what transphobes say. Unless you're saying you want to have sex with me, in which case, boink, go to horny jail. I've been dead for centuries, go find someone who's not dead. As a fair warning, I'm going to have to delve into a bit of political theory and history of various different leftist groups, because the two poles of the spectrum aren't as ideologically or philosophically cohesive as we often operate like they are. The right, most people agree, includes both Lacey Blanders, who's concerned about oil prices and thinks that maybe they're overcorrecting for racism with this affirmative action stuff, as well as the literal fucking Nazis, anarcho-capitalists trying to 3D print guns out of bitcoins. It's technically a phobophilia, and your cousin working in real estate who thinks that being poor needs to be at least a little unfun because how else will all the work get done if we make working it comfortable? And left can include anything from maybe a basic income is humane and necessary as we approach post-scarcity, to lesbians in children's movies are fine as long as it's the same standard of appropriateness as straight people, to being gay is a consumer identity to try and suppress the glorious revolution against capitalism. And for the record, that last one is very bad. It's a lot. And if you really are aliens digging through old YouTube server data for archaeological research, first of all, I'm so sorry. As I said earlier, it's more of a vibe than a scientific dichotomy. Who would have thought that trying to condense complex information about hundreds of millions of people into a binary would be messy and incomplete? There's still room to make use of this dichotomy, but we should really unpack it a little bit and examine whence cometh these vibes. Now, we spend most of our time here taking out trash on the right, because we are on the left and most of the people making problems for us are on the right. But good self-care isn't just fortifying your castle, it's also keeping your own house safe and clean. And we are in politics to push policy closer to that which will keep us and our loved ones safe and clean. Centrism, aka liberalism. Center and center-left are composed of people who are largely indifferent to change, but the center-left leans sometimes ever so slightly towards the left. This could be for various reasons. They could have a friend who is part of a minority group, or they are someone who likes to smoke weed a lot and therefore would like to see it legalized. I will add that these are not straw men, by the way. I have personally met several people who fit these descriptions. You may also hear the center-left in certain countries referred to as liberalism. For the purposes of this discussion, we will combine the two. From the perspective of a trans person, centrists are often the most painful to deal with politically because of their indifference to the more egregious political situations that don't affect them personally. The types of political and social situations that are not easily resolved by the filling out of some forms or a mildly upset tweet on the internet. The types of situations that require a far more involved form of action. This also means it's very rare to see a centrist take meaningful action towards dealing with transphobia, and since many centrists are still working on forming and maturing their political views, this means that they're most susceptible when it comes to being indoctrinated by right-wing dogma. Therefore, as much as we may not initially like their views, as activists, these are people who, pragmatically speaking, are the people most likely to be moved, for good or for evil. And we want to reach them first before fascists pipeline them into being consistently evil. However, this is of course easier said than done, and not everyone has the patience to sit down and explain to a centrist how their political indifference can often be a matter of life-altering consequences for minorities, or worse. And if you see persuasion as the only kind of activism, then you're overlooking people who need our protection now. It is important to note that, while this might seem like we're being super harsh on centrists, many of us started off as centrists ourselves. But rest assured, we're not pulling a "I used to be like you until I grew up" on y'all. Far from it. It's natural to start off any political journey at the center, especially when you have no particular reason to be politically involved yet. I completely recognize that some people reach a centrist position all by themselves without it functioning as Babby's first political position. However, I do think these types of centrists are generally more difficult to reach, since their political position has nothing to do with inexperience. That's not to say that these people cannot be reached at all, it's just that they're more likely to view trans people and other minorities as political pawns that can be argued for or against depending on the debate, or what is most convenient to them in that particular situation. One of the reasons centrists are so dangerous is because they are constantly being bombarded with propaganda, and most of them lack the political literacy to spot it. They share feel-good stories about kids doing bake sales to raise money for a teacher with cancer, and they often just accept that framing of this being a heroic act of kindness instead of asking, why aren't we just giving cancer treatment to everyone who needs it? They are human beings! Jesus! They're also susceptible to twisting of data that creates really toxic perceptions of various groups. Consider the salient exemplar fallacy, which we did a video on, where negative representation is emphasized to generalize the misdeeds of a few onto an entire group of people. Despite that, all of us are our own moral agents, regardless of demographics. fascist ideas can slip into many things, and blockbuster movies such as 300 snuck overt fascist ideas into a movie that was watched by millions. People who didn't know how to spot these ideas might have been sucked into the glorifying visual language and had their politics subtly shifted to the right without them even realizing it. We're linking a video that talks about how 300 included lots of fascist ideals: military elitism, ableism, homophobia, demonization of queer people. And centrists were just like, "Oh yes, bullet time spear! Take that, Persians!" So, how are centrists anti-trans? As a whole, they're not overtly so. But if you argue against things like economic aid for the homeless, you're disproportionately harming people who aren't white, people who are gay or trans or disabled. However, they're also often susceptible to falling for transphobic rhetoric because they fail to recognize bad faith arguments for what they are, or attempt to both sides trans people and anti-trans activists. See also politically homeless, which is basically the label used to virtue signal that someone was formerly on the left of center, but is being pipelined to the right, to the far right even, by transphobia. These are the people that transphobes target with a vulnerability of getting into their heads. Because even if you're a centrist, you agree women should be safe, right? So all a transphobe has to do is convince everyone that trans people are, by virtue of existing and needing to use the toilet, are a threat to women. And from there, it's only a few more steps to convince them that trans healthcare shouldn't be paid for with taxpayer dollars, and that we shouldn't do anything about poverty caused by discrimination. Oh, and one more thing to note with centrists. Often people who call themselves centrists or even liberal will deliberately cloak themselves with that term because they are fascist propagandists who are trying to, hello fellow reasonable person who isn't persuaded by the crazy left to go too far, with one prime example being Tim Pool, who calls himself a liberal, but also actively goes fishing for right-wing talking points out of people who are clearly not having his bullshit. And let's check out this centrist, Konstantin Kisin. First of all, that is an incredibly creepy profile picture. Was that taken on purpose to make him look as creepy as possible? Second, this screenshot is taken from the main CritFacts account, where we deliberately follow transphobes in order to monitor their rhetoric and get receipts, exactly like what we're using now. But let's talk really quickly about that bio, and about the other things that this person says. It takes a refugee from Russia, such as Konstantin Kisin, to appreciate this open, tolerant life in the West, writes Julie Burchill. Who they source is a newspaper that even both sides' centrist organization, Media Bias Network, points out is very clearly right-leaning. Not very centrist of you, but more importantly is the dog whistle that's buried in his bio and the article, the West. The fuck is the West, and why should I love it more than I love any other region on Earth? All human beings have equal inherent worth, so unless you have an ethical criticism of policy, it seems a bit sus to love the West exceptionally. Compared to who and why, pray tell? If you needle these people long enough, you'll almost always see them showing their fascist goals through the cracks in their masks. If you love the West, then you'll love a unifying government that represents the West and can easily be steered to hate things that are not the West. Plus, the no true Scots West fallacy, and bam, easy way to manufacture consent, one whisper at a time. And we've already talked about this group more than we probably should. Don't center the centrists. Part 2, Socialism. Oh, you're a socialist? Name every body. Woo! It's time to talk about the scary word, socialism. Well, scary to some people anyway. Socialism refers to a set of leftist values of mutual aid put into policy, and while many average people associate the term with some of the more extreme political movements, it covers many different topics such as healthcare, ownership of production, and economic and social systems that aim to, as Richard Wolff puts it, soften the harsh edges of capitalism at least somewhat, at least until capitalism is done for. And when we say capitalism, most people respond as if we're somehow asking to abolish currency and voluntary exchange. No, that's communism, or the gift economy. I mean, the gift economy is a pretty neat goal for post-scarcity, where if you need something, oh hey, here you go, we've got everything we need. But socialism isn't even necessarily opposed to capitalism if you define socialism in the government does things sense.
Socialism is when the government does stuff.
In seriousness, capitalism isn't the same thing as the existence of currency or voluntary exchange or markets. It's when people are allowed to own things that they use to extract profit from others. Owning a house that you live in is not exclusive to capitalism. However, owning a house that you do not live in and then rent it out at a profit is capitalism. Socialism either refers to, depending on who you ask, government use of tax dollars for the public good, or forbidding people from owning such things such that they extract profit from other people's work without doing any of their own, such as by being a landlord, CEO, or a day trader. If you're in America, the latter version is probably what you call communism, and it can exist even within capitalism. Co-ops are worker-owned stores. When you get hired, you share in the profits, not just accept a fixed wage. The gist of a social democracy is to supplement the incomes of people who would otherwise be completely left behind by capitalism, but usually isn't incompatible with it. This does blunt some of capitalism's more nefarious effects, such as destitution for those who cannot easily sell labor on an unregulated market, but still leaves profit as the driving force of industry. So how can we refer to this as socialism, you may ask? Depends on your personal understanding of socialism, capitalism, and communism, and if your emphasis with socialism is anti-capitalism, you probably won't. But those who are unfamiliar with the actual leftist principles will refer to any system that doesn't explicitly endorse hardline, rugged individualist, sink-or-swim Darwinian capitalism as socialism. That's just unfortunately how it goes. When it comes to LGBT plus rights, most socialists believe that the structure of our current society is detrimental to our lives compared to other achievable structures, and especially the lives of various marginalized groups, which I would agree with. However, as I pointed out before, socialism is a broad term. It doesn't just refer to one singular viewpoint, but instead offers a multitude of possible solutions under the umbrella of social progress. As an example, there are socialists that prefer to structure our society with the help of a market, similar to what we're familiar with under capitalism, while non-market socialists argue that relying on economics would eventually lead us back into the problems of capitalism. I'd also like to remind any anti-socialists in America that the definition of socialism as when taxes are used for public services or works, then police, roads, military, public schools, prisons would all count as socialism. But most people who call themselves socialists don't see the police system as it is currently implemented as actually helpful to anyone but the rich. The military is bloated, and its size and cost would only make sense in an active wartime in a defensive war, but really the military is mostly being used as mercenaries for the interests of the rich. Being a socialist doesn't mean you think all uses of tax dollars are good. We here at CritFacts think that taxes should be used to help people, not create torture boxes that don't actually help people be safe members of our communities. Which flavor of socialism is right for you mostly comes down to personal preference and priorities, but you can rest assured that most, if not all, socialists are inclusive of trans rights, and most will generally oppose fascist rhetoric whenever they encounter it. And no, National Socialism, aka Nazism a la Nazi Germany, did not meet any of the criteria of socialism. There were no wealth floors, and to the contrary, everyone was basically forced to work or throw down their lives for the government. There was no policy of compassion for their fellow citizens, just treating human beings as disposable labor and pawns for expansionism. There is one group that does call themselves leftists but are actually fascists, though. Consider Nazbols, short for Nationalist Bolsheviks, or Nazi Bolsheviks. These are people who would like to combine the left-wing or socialist economic and extreme right-wing social views. That is, they believe that the government should step in to help people provide an economic baseline, but only for those that they see as the correct people to exist, and push social norms such as rigid ideals of womanhood that center reproduction above all else, and versions of manhood that center throwing yourself away to provide labor for this utopia where nobody is actually happy. It's debatable whether these are left-wing or right-wing, but they are undeniably transphobic, homophobic, racist, ableist, and are rightly opposed by the vast majority of the left. Moving on. Marxism-Leninism, otherwise known as tankies. Note, this covers a wide range of political philosophies. Arguments over what counts as an ML or not can be as fierce and tedious as fights over who counts as a socialist. If you consider yourself a Marxist-Leninist and these criticisms don't apply to you, that's great, but please be cognizant of how other people use this political label and the problems that often emerge in those spaces. It is definitely a lot of a disclaimer, and this is a lot of a section. It gets its name from Marx, who had a lot of thoughts about how capitalism is bad, and Lenin, who also had a lot of thoughts about how capitalism is bad. The resulting political ideology is that there should be a vanguard party which leads the state capitalist society through to a communism. How do we get from A to B? The answer is fuck you. However, this view often results in the idea that we should ignore other axes of oppression besides class, or that other forms of oppression are a distraction from the real issue at hand. When we discussed socialism earlier, I mentioned that, depending on who you ask, some socialists are more tolerant of capitalist principles than others. When it comes to Marxism-Leninism, however, the two are nearly identical besides a few key differences, mostly in governing bodies. Marxism-Leninism is a communist ideology based on orthodox Marxism and Leninism created by Lenin and further developed by Soviet Union leader Joseph Stalin, who most people who like human life and well-being see as a, quote, bad dude, end quote. While there are many different strands of communism out there, Marxism-Leninism is objectively the most popular one considering the fact that most, if not all, leading communist parties in the world adhere to it. This one has very obvious advantages, which is that we can look at countries ruled by these parties and see how well the political ideology stacks up in practice. So how does it stack up? Not very good, as it turns out. I'll spare you the lecture about the history of the Soviet Union, though I would definitely point out that there are a lot of the glaring problems with Marxism-Leninism today that can be traced back to it. While you may be forgiven for thinking that we're dealing with a form of Marxism, Marxism-Leninism as an ideology is, for the most part, conceptualized around Lenin and his unique take on Marxism. It centers around the idea of having one party of elite individuals, known as a vanguard party, look after the state in what is known as the dictatorship of the proletariat. In case you're unaware, proletariat is a term used to describe the working class within Marxist theory. It's basically a catch-all term for the working class, while bourgeoisie is used to define people in the middle upper class backgrounds. This one-party state is often marked by strict authoritarian rule sets, which was a defining characteristic of the Soviet Union that is still reflected in countries such as Cuba, Vietnam, and North Korea today. To a degree, this also applies to China, but less so nowadays since China has been moving towards fully embracing capitalist ideas for the last 20 years or so. The specific rules, as well as the strictness of said rules, differs from Leninist country to country, but they all share a general dislike of the West and Western society in general. This can make it quite difficult to talk about LGBT+ rights from Marxism-Leninism perspective because some supporters could argue that LGBT+ as a concept is rooted in Western privilege and bourgeoisie culture, which is both false and, what? I didn't become gay because I'm rich, I'm poor as fuck. Others may also falsely argue that trans people are a conspiracy of the pharmaceutical industry and therefore inherently capitalist. Because why bother with material reality when you can just jump into conspiracy nonsense?
If the trans movement was about, making sure gender non-conforming people aren't fired or evicted, don't face violence on the streets, and have help out of poverty, prostitution, and addiction, I wouldn't think twice about supporting it. But mostly it's not about that, 1 out of 8. It's more about promoting a postmodern, idealist ideology that denies the reality of biological sex. It's a vehicle for big pharma to create lifelong medical patients and for scuzzy fetishists to get society to play along with their kinks by denying 2 out of 8.
Yeah, I give that one a 2 out of 8. And here is captured my biggest complaint with MLs, particularly transphobic MLs. They are making excuses to deny our freedoms because they think it will bring about the economic revolution faster if they throw trans people under the bus. Which is both false and also, what freedom do I have if I can't love who I love without being attacked for it? what freedom do I have if I can't decide for myself what goes into my own body or not? Maybe I'd be less poor if we embraced communism as described by these tankies, but I'd be miserable. I need bodily autonomy to be happy. I need autonomy of identity, of meaning-making, freedom to be me. And while capitalism robs me of this by taking away my access to the things I need to live unless I comply with an exploitative job market or so on, I would be forsaking this freedom to be a little less poor under these Marxist-Leninist principles. And in this case, he's trying to foster support for his version of communism by using far-right talking points, calling people perverts if we have sex he doesn't personally find tasteful, and throwing out dog whistles like postmodernism, idealist, individualist ideology. That was a tongue twister. Like, what are you even trying to communicate with any of those? Do you even know what postmodernism is, my dude?
She, her in bio. Are leftists beginning to realize how much itpol/gender ideology fit in perfectly with US imperialism? How many genderqueers need to work for Lockheed Martin for y'all to see that there's nothing revolutionary or Marxist about this crap?
Because if postmodernism means nothing has to make sense, I'd say that this take here is pretty postmodernist, because this dude is claiming that the presence of pronouns in a professional job listing network is indicative that trans people are bad, or that trans people must all support his idea of revolution or else we are all moral failures. It's sneakily using the narrative that all of us must throw away all of our individuality in order to join a revolution led by charismatic individuals who know what's best for all of us, but who lack any means of accountability by the people they're supposedly looking out for. That just because a little bit of anti-transphobia made its way into a job board means that gender identity is just a game we play to keep ourselves from contributing to the glorious revolution. Excuse me if I'm not interested in a political movement that sees everything about me as disposable and replaceable, that sees my happiness and well-being as an afterthought to what other people can extract out of my body and my existence. Because that's just most of the problems I have with capitalism, but move the problem intensities around. We'll take 3 points from threat of poverty and move them over to fears of being shot if the next dictator thinks being gay is degeneracy.
Western leftoids are pathetically misinformed about the gender issue. Big Pharma will pathologize and medicalize a variety of things in order to accumulate profits, and gender nonconformity is no such exception. Recently, there's articles coming out about antidepressant medications confirming what Marxists were already talking about. Depression is caused by environment, not because of a chemical imbalance. Big Pharma profits off capitalism-induced depression by selling bogus meds.
Of course, I'm talking in broad strokes here. There are Marxism-Leninists who don't see it that way and are more supportive of fundamental LGBT plus rights, but I feel that this anti-LGBT plus view is far too common within ML circles for me not to mention it. I mean, look at this shit.
Watch them writhe like worms at sieve. They hate the fact communism doesn't turn everything into colorful jellyfish and isn't the adobe of their disgusting personal fantasies. I made a more inclusive image for the left-wing snowflakes who feel this image is not representative of their personal fantasy. Here is the correction.
So, this person hates left-wing snowflakes who want to allow people to be happy and whimsical and lighthearted if they want to? I don't care if you think a grown man in a kigu is cringe. If he's not hurting anyone, let him wear the damn kigu. At least if you believe in freedom! I don't know, I just think that if your ideal government tells people how they're supposed to be happy without any ethical argument for what you're prescribing, then maybe it's kind of shit, actually. Like, these people hate gay people for the same reason that the Quiverful movement is a thing. They see reproductive labor as essential for perpetuating their own beliefs by raising kids whose ideology they can control, at least until the age of 18, or however long they can keep them trapped in their propaganda bubbles. Without getting into a ton of Marxist political theory in regards to class reductionism can best be summed up as the belief that whatever struggles are being faced by the proletariat at large, such as homophobia, sexism, racism, etc., can all be traced back to class relations and, more specifically, the exploitation of the working class under capitalism. This can mean ignoring other forms of discrimination with the idea that class supersedes them, and that destroying capitalism will suddenly make other forms of bigotry disappear. While capitalism certainly doesn't help matters, it's ridiculous to think that all forms of bigotry would suddenly disappear after capitalism falls, and in the meantime we cannot effectively organize with people in groups that are actively discriminating against us or ignoring the oppression we face. I'm not just poor because of capitalism. I could easily be poor in a communist economy that didn't have a wealth floor if trans need not apply is above every workplace entrance. Most supporters of Marxism-Leninism tend not to use the phrase class reductionism to describe this trend, but this name was given to it through the years of leftists and people who otherwise took issue with them not addressing the discrimination faced by different minorities. So, what does this mean for LGBT plus people? If we look at history, LGBT plus people were never perceived much in a positive light throughout the Soviet Union and its satellite states. Prior to the establishment of the CPSU, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, being gay or transgender were both considered illegal, so removing this barrier can definitely be considered a win. However, as soon as Joseph Stalin took control of the CPSU, he came down harder on LGBT plus people than ever, going so far as to send thousands of them into the gulags, arguably even worse than Thatcher. But of course, that was then. How does the ideology stack up nowadays? Undoubtedly some things have changed. Some trans people are Leninists, but this obviously doesn't cancel out the transphobia that exists in some ML spaces and in ML history. The existence of marginalized groups within a community doesn't mean that community doesn't have bigotry, much as how the existence of gay conservatives doesn't mean that conservatism as a whole is not homophobic. Apropos of nothing, here's a dude who tried to form the Log Cabin Republicans, giving up and admitting that it was all a waste of time trying to convince the right to stop being homophobic. We warned you, doofus. Another aspect of Leninism is that, due to its authoritarian nature, it is mostly incompatible with other leftist ideologies. In particular, tankies seem to share hate boners for anarchists, which brings us to the last and possibly farthest left ideology on the leftist scale, Anarchism. Immediately after hearing the word anarchism, no doubt your mind's eye is projecting all sorts of wretched images of people destroying things, mostly government things, because that's what anarchists do, right? They destroy things, and they hate the government. Right?
That's dishonest. Low.
Not really. Though it depends on what you mean by government. You see, anarchists are not opposed to leadership as a concept. I don't think I've seen a single anarchist who thought we needed to get rid of leaders for the sake of it. The leading position is not the problem in an anarchist worldview, it's the power hierarchy. Consider Mildred of the Eyes, who talks a lot about anarchist philosophy and how we can take small steps to achieve a government where people have less and less undue power over others until we're all free to achieve our own happiness as long as we're considerate to those around us doing the same. I'd also highly recommend Spice 8-Rack's video on the fundamentals of anarchism. Link in the doobly-doo. It's pretty great if you keep up with Magic the Gathering at all. There are loads of MTG lore jokes, but the video is still informative, understandable, and pretty damn entertaining, even if you've never tapped a single mana. Remember how we briefly touched on class relations under capitalism? Well, anarchists believe that the best way to dismantle capitalism is by challenging authority, particularly that of institutions and the state. With this in mind, it's no real surprise that so many Leninists view anarchists as their enemy, since Leninist ideology predominantly relies on authority and state power. As an ideology, anarchism isn't as clearly defined as, say, capitalism. What I mean by this is that anarchism is mostly defined by one's opposition to power hierarchies, but how we should go about doing so very much depends on what type of anarchism we're talking about. This results in the much repeated political joke that there's dozens and dozens of different branches of anarchism, but honestly, in reality, the most prominent forms of anarchy can be boiled down to about a handful. There's anarcho-communism, anarcho-feminism, anarcho-syndicalism, green anarchism, anarcho-primitivism, and the list goes on. In that sense, the movement is kind of similar to socialism in that they're both core principles and not necessarily harsh guidelines. Like I said, I think that most people of either branch of anarchism will agree that the core principles behind their political beliefs, so I think it's fair to say that there's not much hostility between different anarchists, surprisingly. You'd think it would all be anarchy, Anarchism is usually viewed as the most proactive form of leftism, and therefore also the most radical. There's a few reasons for that. Anarchists have historically always opposed fascism and its leaders, and they will therefore not hesitate to organize and let their voices be heard. As an example, if you look at any modern-day anti-fascist protest, there's a very good chance that anarchists are behind it. A more notorious form of this opposition is the Black Bloc, a group of anarchist protesters organized around black clothes, hoodies, and masks in order to preserve anonymity from political opposition, usually fascists such as police. This is also known as Antifa if you are stateside. Fascists and fascist enablers love to point a damning spotlight on this tactic. But really, can you blame them for not wanting Nazis and the police, who have historically been known to support those Nazis, to be able to track them down, harass them, or arrest them, God knows what else? An active approach to political activism requires more personal care, after all. So when it comes to transphobia, I don't think trans people have much to worry about from anarchists, like, at all. In fact, I'm willing to state that anarchism is probably the safest political space for trans folks when it comes down to it. Since transphobia and fascism usually go hand in hand, there's been more than one encounter between Antifa protesters and transphobes, much to dismay of the phobes. I also think that anarchists are the most willing to point out transphobic rhetoric and confront others about it. Unlike other leftists who sometimes use subjects such as LGBT+ struggles as minor distractions, anarchists tend to center minorities first in their politics. Summary so far. This video, it's already pretty long by YouTube standards, but in the scope of political discussion, it's actually really brief, and I hope this has been a useful summary of the political landscape as seen by a bunch of trans people. This is a very brief introduction to our survey of the landscape as leftists, because we all really strongly vibe with the whole people should be safe and free, and that means we have to take care of each other, so let's put it into policy already. Our goal with this was to cover the different ideologies that we as progressive-minded LGBT+ people might not immediately associate with transphobia. We're sort of hardwired to view transphobia as a right-wing fundamentalist viewpoint because, well, it often is. However, many transphobic talking points can and do make their way over into leftist circles from time to time, and I hope this video did a good job of going over the different leftist flavors and seeing how well they tend to view queer people as a whole. At least, as a start to this very complex topic. This is by no means supposed to be an endorsement of one leftist political ideal of the other, except for anarchism, which we wholeheartedly endorse, and a condemnation for nosboles, because fuck nosboles. Remember, the intention is to make it easier for trans people to navigate our own space and to help leftists understand how transphobia and other bigotries can still manifest on the left, and that we have to continually work to be better people and spot these harmful tropes and attitudes before they make their way into policy or action. We always have to remain vigilant, and we highly recommend the classic video by Tube de Philosophie, where Abigail Thorne lays out some classic examples of how antisemitism became a tool to bend entire nations into a destructive path against each other and themselves. And how it's so pervasive that even Karl fucking Marx, who was himself Jewish by ancestry, said really anti-Semitic shit in his works that may have even helped fuel anti-Semitism in Weimar Germany. Although that problem already had plenty of fuel without speculating on whether or not he specifically contributed. Not that they would have liked him in Weimar Germany anyway because he was a communist. So let's take all the time to examine all political groups for underlying prejudice and learn how to spot these problems before it's too late. In case of fire, exits are on your left. That's going to do it for this episode of CritFacts. I hope this essay has been informative for you, and if you want further support our endeavors, you should definitely consider supporting us on Patreon, because we cannot escape from this capitalist hellhole right now. And as of right now, this is how we keep our channel going. Thank you, and have a lovely rest of your day. Crit, out. Look at this shit. This shit.